Well, it's taken Julia Gillard just a week in the top job to stitch up a deal with the miners that Kevin Rudd thought might take months to reach. But how's the new PM and her mining tax deal playing in the heartlands? We're joined from Brisbane by Steve Ciobo, the opposition tourism and arts spokesman, and here in Sydney by Jason Clare, the Parliamentary Secretary for Employment. Welcome to both of you.
Good evening, Lee.
Good evening, Lee.
Jason Clare, surely the resolution of the mining tax issue means that the decks are cleared for an election?
Well, it's a great achievement. The Prime Minister said last week that fixing the mining tax issue would be her top priority, and it's taken her a week and it's been fixed. A couple of weeks ago, as you said, many people thought this was intractable. This was a problem that couldn't be fixed. The Prime Minister has resolved this in a week, and it shows that she's a leader who can get things done. That's what people expect of government. They pay us to go to Canberra to work together to fix things, get things done, and that's what the Prime Minister has done today.
So should we voters be expecting that she'll be calling an election very soon?
The Prime Minister said an election's due sometime in the second half of the year, but her focus is on getting the government back on track and getting things done. She's got a record of getting things done, whether it's getting rid of work choices or the national curriculum in education or the My School website. Today was just the latest example of that, of a leader who can get in, get people around the table, sort things out, listen to people's concerns and get an outcome.
Why was there a need to change the name of the tax?
People were telling me that it was confusing. A lot of people thought that a resource super profits tax was a tax on superannuation. The name that's been given to this reform, I think, better reflects the type of tax that it is. It's very similar to the petroleum resource rent tax, and it reflects that. It's taking what happens offshore, onshore.
Steve Ciobo, what do you make of the name change?
Well, Lee, let's be clear about what's going on. We've got a situation where, as Tony Abbott has said, we have the same product with a different salesman, and I can see that Jason is in full sales mode tonight. What we have had take place today is Julia Gillard effectively trying to portray what has been a massive backflip by Labor as a victory. All that's actually happened is that the Labor Party has executed through on their political problem to now portray it as some kind of way to sell it as being of benefit to the Australian people, when in reality we still have a great big new tax on the Australian people and on the Australian mining industry, which ultimately will cost jobs, cost investment, and still presents a massive sovereign risk for Australian companies.
Who exactly is the opposition representing in its opposition to this, given that the mining industry is on board?
We're representing the Australian people, Lee. We've got a genuine concern about the future of this country under the Labor Party. We know that they've plunged us into a huge level of debt. They're addicted to reckless spending, and what we're attempting to do is to ensure that good policy is rolled out across this country. We need good policy. We don't need great big new taxes which are simply there as a political fix-up for this Labor Party and this Prime Minister Julia Gillard, who has been there every step of the way with Kevin Rudd on all the very poor quality spending decisions this government has made, who are now desperately reaching for a new tax to try to make up for their massive shortfall as a consequence of this very bad spending.
Jason Clare, how did the government get itself in a position where it was bleeding on this issue for weeks, when apparently it could be resolved in just a few days with concentrated effort?
Well, it shows that Julia Gillard was the game changer here. It was her intervention that created goodwill. She said, we'll take the government's ads off the television. And the industry responded. Get people around the table and listen to their views, understand what their concerns are, and put something together. It shows what you can do when there's real and genuine negotiations.
Well, why couldn't Kevin Rudd do that?
Steve's grasping at straws here, because if the mining industry really thought that there was a problem, that jobs were going to be lost and industries destroyed, why did they sign up to this heads of agreement with the government today?
Well, Steve
We didn't have the mining industry. Well, it's not the mining industry, Lee. What it is are three companies. We've had three companies. All the other smaller miners have been excluded from these discussions. It's not as if this is a great victory that's being heralded across the mining sector. It's not. What you have is a heads of agreement with the three biggest miners, and we have a number of small miners who still are expressing their very genuine and sincere concerns, Lee, about the implications of this great big new tax on the mining industry.
But when the Mining Council's on board, though, and you've got the big mining companies on board, I'm just wondering if smaller mining companies, the names of which people aren't familiar with, the figureheads of which they don't know, is that really going to have the same impact? Tony Abbott said today that he thinks that the next election will be a referendum on the mining tax. Do you really think it's the sort of issue that's going to capture people's imaginations and polarise them?
Absolutely. In states like Queensland, in states like Western Australia, this great big new tax that the Labor Party has imposed is a forerunner of more taxes to come. This is a government desperate for new forms of revenue, a government desperate to undo the massive damage that they've done as a result of their reckless spending, Lee. So I do think this will have cut through, because ultimately, although they're not the big miners, all of these small mining companies employ tens of thousands of people, and they are the drivers of the Australian economy. They're the people that have helped to keep this country in good economic shape.
Lee, you make a good point. Tony Abbott is now out on his own. Even the Minerals Council are supporting this. Tony Abbott doesn't even have his own side supporting him, because you had Peter Dutton buy BHP shares after Tony Abbott said that this was a tax that was going to destroy jobs. So he can't convince his own side. He can't convince the Minerals Council. He's become Robinson Crusoe on this. I think the election will end up being fought on a lot of different issues. Ultimately, it'll be a choice between Julia Gillard, who will drive reform, and you've seen evidence of that today, and Tony Abbott, who's got a record of pulling money out of health and going back to work choices.
Steve Ciobo, a chance to respond to that?
Well, what Jason just